All right, everybody, welcome to Theory Underground. If you've ever heard that the intention of the author does not matter, that it really just matters what the text says to you, that it's all up for interpretation, well, then you're likely aware that we do things a little different at Theory Underground. Not only do we do things a little different, but we found somebody who argues against this position and has been arguing against it for a long time, long before Professor or Dr. Walter Benn Michaels was hated for the positions that he has taken with Dr. Adolf Reed Jr. in the culture war against race reductionism and in defense of a class politics. Long before the hatred he garnered for doing that work, he was already under constant fire for this position called radical intentionality. Radical intentionality is an approach that says you cannot talk about sense-making or meaning or interpretation at all without first some kind of underlying assumption that what is being interpreted, if it's a text, was written with an original sort of intention. So the last thing I'll say is Theory Underground is a lecture course, seminar, ongoing research seminar, and book publishing platform. YouTube and podcasts are just a couple of the ways that we get the word out so that people who want to dive in deeper and actually roll their sleeves up to do some reading and like writing and learn how to present and all of this kind of stuff. Well, if you're looking for that training, but you don't want to spend $100,000 at the university to acquire it, then stick around until the end of this video, watch the PSA, and get involved. We'd love to have you. All right, enjoy. Welcome back, Walter. How you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. And so last time we had you on, we talked a lot about the trouble with diversity and class politics. We wanted to bring you back to get into what we never really had a chance to go into, which I think is really important for our audience to think about, and that is the critique of theory, right? The critical critique of critical theory. But specifically, your time with Derrida and teaching Derrida and coming into some kind of a critique of him. So where do you want to start with this?
Well, I mean, if we can sort of talk about against theory is actually the name of an article that a guy called Steve Knapp and I wrote a long time ago. And we were both, our idea of what the theory questions are came out of literary theory and to some extent legal theory. And we both written, and I've written a lot about legal theory, but about one particular question, which like most everybody listening to this will be familiar with in legal terms. And anybody who's done any literary criticism will be familiar with there too. And that is what determines what the meaning of any text is. So like if you're thinking about like basically legal stuff, the sort of standard version of that question is, all right, what is it that gives you the meaning of the Constitution? Is it what the framers intended by it? Is it what the words mean in the language? Is it what the reader's share is? And exactly the same set of arguments were produced in effect about literary criticism. In fact, literary criticism for a long time, and to some extent still, is dominated by a thing called the intentional fallacy. And actually, there are a lot of people in legal theory called anti-originalists who are committed to the idea that whatever it means, it doesn't mean what the people who wrote it meant by it. And when I was first starting to teach in the late 70s, I'd been super influenced by Derrida. It was like a complete breath of fresh air in literary theory. I was part of a journal when I was at Johns Hopkins called Glyph. You can sometimes find we put out 8 issues. They're completely devoted to deconstructive work. And actually, Derrida's famous exchange with John Searle was printed first in those journals. And when Steve Knapp and I started teaching literary theory at Berkeley, we really focused on Derridian texts. And Derrida's position is a kind of complicated one there. Derrida's position is, in a certain sense, we were interested in him because he thought that the author's intention mattered, but he thought that it could not, as he put it, control the scene of utterance or control the scene of writing. So that something else mattered as well. And I kind of went into it thinking that myself, but came out of it on the complete other side. So we produced a position that, Stewardship gets called something like radical intentionalism. And what that means is that every text, legal, literary, what I'm saying to you right now, the shopping list you might write for someone else later, or to use a Jordan example, the shopping list you might write for yourself later. Every text means only and always what its author intends. Doesn't mean something different, and its meaning doesn't change. And the argument around, no one believed that at the time. When I started working on anti-racist stuff, the class politics stuff we discussed last time, there was lots of objections. I'd go give talks, still give talks. People were furious, et cetera, et cetera. But when the theory stuff was at its height, I guarantee you, no one's ever been angrier than a bunch of English professors being told that texts only mean what their authors intend them to mean. So that was the basic position. So where did the basic position come from? There are a lot of different kinds of arguments. The original, here's one way to put the argument, not even to stick with the article. So there are basically these three sort of ways of thinking about this. Means what the author means by it, means what the language means by it, means what the readers mean by it, or what most people think it means somehow, some kind of combination of the three. So there's an old famous example. There's a poem by Andrew Marvell, which if anybody took an English class, it was like a survey class, you probably had to read. It's called To His Coy Mistress. It's a Carpe Diem poem. The point of the poem is, hey, let's sleep together now because we're going to get old and we'll be dead. Carpe Diem, seize the day. And at one point he says, it begins famously, we but world enough in time, this coyness mistress were no crime. And he refers to his vegetable love. So the question was always, what does he mean by vegetable love? What exactly is vegetable love? So what we know, we have an account of what the meaning of the word vegetable is. So for us, the meaning of the word vegetable is vegetables, eat your vegetables. But if that's the case, is that what he meant? Did he meant that love is basically somehow vegetable? People often think that, no, but in the 17th century, or the period he's writing, vegetable probably meant growing. So did he mean basically just sort of growing the way a vegetable does? So the question is, what does it mean? What do we think it means? So if you think, okay, the standard view for many years has been, it means what it means in the language. So, okay, but that's a problem because the initial problem right away is whose language? Does it mean what it means in English the way it's spoken now? Does it mean what it means in English Marvell spoke? Does it mean what it means in we can invent a language, call it Schminglish. In Schminglish, everything means the opposite of what it means in English. Which language? Well, you can say, it means what it means in his language. He wrote it. But then you're actually no longer committed to the rules of the language. You're committed to actually his intention. Because you say, why would we prefer his language? Why does his language matter? Well, because he was writing his language. Well, if we care about what he meant in his language, then what we're just interested in is what he meant. And the question of what language it's in is secondary. The question of what we meant, it's interesting only because it's what he meant. You say, okay, fine, we're not intentionalists. We care about what it means in the language. Well, okay, our language. Well, if we care about what it means in our language, then we care not about what he meant by it, but about what it means to us. But then we have a different kind of problem, which is, what's our language? Supposing you are a Schminglish speaker. Suppose you just invent Schminglish on the stop. And I say, no, dude, it doesn't mean what it means in English. It means what it means in Schminglish. But why? There's no reason for it to do that. Because more of us speak English than Schminglish. It makes no difference whatsoever. So from the theoretical standpoint, the claim that it means what it means in our language totally depends upon who we are. And if it depends upon who we are, then what we're just saying is, the meaning of the text is whatever it means to us. But if we're saying its meaning is whatever it means to us, we're saying its meaning is whatever it makes us think of. It makes us think of what that word means in English. Supposing actually what it made you think of was right away, my grandmother never made me eat my vegetables. My mother always made me eat my vegetables. I love my grandmother more than my mother. And when I see the word vegetable, what it makes me think of is my grandma. And to me, this poem's about my grandma. So fine. Things make us think of things all the time. but we wouldn't ordinarily advance that as an interpretation of the poem. It would not be to say, well, what the poem is really about is my grandma. And then you were to say, well, actually, no, dude, it's really about my grandma. And we're not actually having an argument. There's nothing to argue about. We're just saying it makes us think of different things. And in fact, it's a common our experience that like words and many other things will make us think of different things. So we thought, okay, first of all, we go with the idea that it means what it means in the language. But that produces a problem right away because we don't know which language. And then we go with the idea, okay, it means what it means in the author's language. That produces a problem if we don't want to be intentionalist because that's just a way of being intentionalist. And we say, okay, it means what it means in our language. That produces a problem because, in fact, if we're saying it means what it means in our language, we're just saying it means whatever it makes us think of, and we're not even giving accounts of what it means. We're just giving accounts of what it makes us think of. So what are we left with? We're actually back to the author's intention. So when Steve and I first started working on this stuff, the idea was not that it's important to go for the author's intention, that we didn't have a kind of parti pris in favor of the author's intention. It was that that's just the only thing that's left. There actually isn't another coherent out of what it is that determines the meaning of the text. And there was a further point. The further point was lots of people who were intentionalists, insofar as some people were, they thought it was like, some of them thought it was a moral point. Well, you should go for the author's intention because, don't you want people to try to figure out what your intent is? So we didn't think there was any moral point to it. We thought that actually everybody already did that. That's what you were doing when you were interpreting a text. Some people would say, well, it's a methodological point. Don't do this, go for the author's intention. But our argument was that you already were going for the author's intention. Whether you knew it or not, you were already doing it. So it wasn't a methodological point. You couldn't help it. So the final point was it didn't do you any good to know this. This was, in a way, the most controversial thing. What we're actually describing was just like the conditions of what meaning are and what interpretation is. So that's why it was called against theory, because there was nothing you could do with it. It was only an argument against other kinds of theoretical arguments to show that they were wrong and to show furthermore that our practice, what we did every day, was actually just look for someone's intention. And that people's accounts, when they thought they were doing something different, they were mistaken about what they were doing. And that when you learned you were doing the author's intention, still it wouldn't help you. It didn't do you any good. So the point was there, a kind of argument against the utility of literary theory. So it was originally made at a moment when everybody thought, including me, that literary theory was like the most important thing in the world if you were a literary critic. So the argument against literary theory was, for people like me, made a major change and was in its period very controversial. So in literary theory, people don't care about that much anymore, but they totally continue to care about it in legal theory. And in legal theory, it actually is ongoing. And of course, it's beginning to come back now in more general terms as well, because the current form of the existence of artificial intelligence and large language programs, large language learning programs, and of all the chatbots we're confronted with every day has made the example against theory relevant again. Why has it done that? Because the very original example, I'll stop with this sort of questions, was when we wrote the essay, suppose you're walking along a beach and you look down there, and the way we did it, because we were literary critics, you see a bunch of marks in the sand, but you don't see them as marks in the sand. You see them as the first stanza of a very famous Wordsworth poem, Slumbered by Spirit Seal. She said first line, Slumbered by Spirit Seal. And you look at it, you think, well, without even thinking what you think, you read right away, you read it. Someone said, what is that? You say, that's the first line of Slumbered by Spirit Seal. Then the waves wash in on the beach. And when the waves wash back, you see not only the first line of Slumbered by Spirit Seal, but you see the second line also of Slumbered by Spirit Seal. So you now got two lines of Slumbered by Spirit Seal. And then someone says to you, well, what is that? So our idea was that when you look at that and you read it as a Slumbered by Spirit Seal, you're already, in fact, treating it without even thinking about it as if it were written by somebody producing those lines. That is, if it were an act, somebody doing something. The reason it's kind of like weird when the waves wash in is because the waves wash in makes it look like what? Makes it look like, well, no, there's no one doing anything. The waves washing in means kind of accident that's produced some marks in the sand, that look like, not only 2 lines of poetry in English, but 2 lines of poetry in English that already exist and are written by this guy Wordsworth. But so it's kind of a plausible example. But that example has been made completely plausible by the existence of AI. Now we can constantly are encountering, right, things that have been written by someone. We want to say, no, they weren't written by some person. So what do we think? Well, the example of a slumbered by spirit seal, there's a famous debate over a slumbered by spirit seal in literary critical studies. And that is when Wordsworth ends it by imagining that his dead love, Lucy, is rolled around in Earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. That is, she's dead, and she is rolling around with the Earth, with rocks and stones and trees. So there have been 2 kinds of original interpretations of that. One was, that sucks. She's gone from me forever. She's like a rock or a stone or a tree. She's part of a world that is completely alien to me. I'll never have her again. But then there was another kind of commitment or theory or account which said, no, actually, at this point in his life, Wordsworth was really interested in pantheism. And the version of pantheism, the idea that, no, nature should be thought of as alive, and trees should be thought of as alive, and even rocks and stones are thought of as alive. And so it's wrong to think of her as dead in just a sense of alienated from us forever. On the contrary, it's kind of reassuring to think that she's not gone. She's part of a world that is still a world in which has a life of its own and which has a life which it in some degree shares with us. So is it a happy ending? Where if we're all pantheists, she's part of the great world of living nature, or is it an unhappy ending? So suppose it's washed up by the shore, right? It's washed up by the waves on the shore. We have to decide whether it's kind of like a happy ending or a sad ending. How can you possibly have anything to decide about it? The decision about whether it's a happy ending or a sad ending is a decision about what someone meant those words to be. If you think the waves are produced by accident, if you think, the marks are produced by accident, if you think the marks that you see in front of you on your computer screen were produced by a machine that's basically a kind of like super, super fast, super skilled autocorrect machine. And the question is, you say to that machine, so, dude, is it ironic or is it non-ironic? Is it happy or is it sad? In order to come up with an answer to it's happy or it's sad, you're already treating it as if it were a person who had intentions. So the point about going back to the original example was, when you saw it washed up on the shore, you realized that they looked like marks, but you actually couldn't treat them as marks because the question about whether it had a happy ending or a sad ending was a question that could not in principle be answered because nobody meant it to have either a happy ending or a sad ending. The question of whether it was ironic or not ironic. And this is where Derrida came in. Derrida has a famous example in a famous remark in one of these early texts in semi-urban context. But he says, look, we're in limited ink. He says, no marks alone, no code alone can determine whether a sentence is ironic or not ironic. Only the intention can do that. But the point about that is that every sentence, or almost every sentence, you can imagine a little way out of it, is either ironic or not ironic. The ironic one is, well, he uses these words, but he's using them ironically. But the non-ironic one is just he's using his words, but he's using them non-ironically. With every situation, with every moment of interpretation, deciding whether something is ironic or non-ironic is deciding about how the person who is using the words was using them. So the point about, and when we did this little critique of AI, and actually it's matched by a more famous critique done by computer people at the same time, the stochastic parrot argument, the whole point was to interpret these things at all, we treat it as if it were a person. But in fact, we know perfectly well that it's not a person, although some people have managed to convince themselves that, well, maybe it's not a person yet, maybe it can't quite have intentions yet, but if it gets faster, gets deeper, gets whatever, then it will start to have intentions. But the point, at least for now, is that if you don't treat it as having intentions, you're not treating those things as if they were language. So everybody has to treat them as if they have intentions in order to treat them as if they were language. But what that actually just shows from our standpoint is that reading something as a text, whether it's a constitution, a shopping list, or a chatbot, is treating it as if it were a person. And the minute you suspend the idea, try to treat it as if it weren't a person, then you actually have no reason to say those marks mean anything. So it's either meaninglessness all the way down or it's intentionality all the way down. And the against theory part is that those are the only two things. There's nothing else. There's no complicated view about intention you can have. There's no sort of sense of, well, there's something else that goes on there as well. There's just these two things. And in fact, we're never really making the choice because we're always doing the first one. We're always treating them as if they were intended.
I feel like
so before I started doing politics, that's what everybody hated about me and Steve then. And Steve's politics is still actually more moderate than mine.
Before you focused on politics, this is what everyone hated you for.
Yeah, it's just what I got really used to being hated for, and I kind of liked it.
Yeah, you're like, okay.
Politics thing was more complicated. I mean, actually, it's not more complicated. In a way, it's simpler. But the politics thing was like, yeah. Then you get all these moral questions about. I once gave an against theory talk when we were first doing this stuff, and actually, the guy in the audience wanted to fight me.
That
I'm an against theorist, not a fighter. But people were extremely outraged by what seemed like a super simple thing, right? Which is that, yeah, it just means what the author intends.
Like I have,
I'll give you one thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I have so much stuff on this. There's ways that, for instance, I would like to play devil's advocate. I have some knee-jerk things that I think audience members might say. I also have, I'm pretty sure, at least one way of complicating radical intentionalism that I do believe in. But then with that, but I don't want to get into that just yet because I also want to let this breathe. And I want to say the reason I care so much is because this has become an ongoing struggle for us, because what we call theory, what we think we're doing, it's not something that's just within language. It's not something that we're just making up. We're trying to understand the actual world situation today and trying to figure out what to do about it. And this literary criticism approach, this rhetoric approach, this debate club approach that has mainstreamed this conception of theory. I don't know if it's how mainstream it is today, but it's definitely around, and we definitely run into it. It doesn't think we can do anything. It doesn't think we actually can understand the situation. It would say there is no transcendental signified, which means there is no outside of your own head or outside of the language.
Right. So the thing about it is that, what your it was called against theory because really at that moment what literary theory was a set of problems about these sets of issues. And basically we just wanted to draw attention to the argument, and calling it against theory really did that. Succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. If you were doing it over again, maybe you would have called it something else that was a little more against interpretive theory or something like that. But actually, it turns out that almost everybody, all the people who we were interested in, and a lot of whom remain extremely important today, so someone like Foucault, who is continued to be important ever since. Foucault definitely had a position about this. It's in his whole thing on, the author function. And he was completely, 180 degrees wrong. He had exactly the sort of anti-intentionalist view about this stuff. But if you speak more generally about critical theory, that's, I think, a kind of different argument. You're associated in theory with critique, with a certain kind of skepticism. And the skepticism is skepticism around the transcendental signified. Well, we can't really know anything. Famous Derrida remark, there's nothing outside the text. But actually, Derrida himself often said that he was completely misunderstood on that. He could just as easily have said there's nothing outside context. He was not trying to show that there was nothing in the world. He was trying to show that our relation to things in the world and our relation to text were not as fundamentally different as people wanted them to be. I actually think he's, importantly right about that.
Good point.
So, yeah, the skepticism there is real. The skepticism was a real position, and the skeptical position, I think, is in the end an empty position because of a lot of the standard arguments about skepticism, which is like, dude, you keep on acting as if there's a world. As long as you keep on acting as if there's a world, as long as you can have skepticism about other bodies or skepticism about other minds. So we're standard one. Yeah, I know my own mind. I've experienced that. But how do I know that you have a mind? And for all I know, you could just be like a bot talking this. And you say, yeah, but if we keep on treating people, this is a famous point made by the pragmatist Peirce. If you keep on treating people as if they had minds, your skepticism is not real. He called it a kind of artificial skepticism. And that kind of artificial academic skepticism is a real thing in the world, and it's a real political thing. Now, so I don't think that political theory is weak because it doesn't describe something that's in the world. It does. However, the question of whether a bunch of political theorists sitting around talking about how to change the world is an effective way of changing the world, that's a completely genuine political question. And the answer to that, I think, is pretty obvious that it's not. You know, your previous guest I just saw the last few minutes ago was talking about, you know, what it would mean to produce, like, for him, what he was calling liberal socialism, and the importance of doing that. And I sort of completely agree with that, but I actually just don't think we need any political theory at all to rely to begin to think about what it would mean to institute liberal socialism. What you need is like the attempt to build a working class movement. I myself think you can only do that in the US through unions, if you can do it at all. And yeah, you need to be able to address people's questions about what seem to us theoretical issues that might seem to them theoretical issues. But it's not so much a question of like coming up with the best theory as it is a question of coming up with showing how the questions that animate political theorists are also the questions that animate people, like, for example, how to get universal health care and begin to do that. So, right. To me, it's an organizing problem. It's a fundamental organizing problem, but it is an organizing problem more than it is a political theory problem. I mean, probably we all agree, as your previous guest was saying, that American healthcare sucks and that what we need is universal healthcare, and that was at the heart of the Sanders campaign. Our failure to do that's not been a theoretical failure. So there's a different way of being not exactly against theory, but a little skeptical about theory, and that is saying, if you truly want to do political work, maybe becoming an English professor is not the best way to start.
Right.
So, yeah.
I want to come back to the idea that we don't need political theory and to your position on a hard intentionalism, but I want to let Nance take the steering wheel. I'm going to grab a refill on my drink of water, and then I'll be right back. I'm listening though as I run go get it.
No problem.
I think I like intentionalism. I don't know if I would do the radical bit. I don't know if I would commit 100%, but I think like I'm 98% there with intentionalism. I do want to protect some type of enchantment in the world. But as you were talking about this, first I thought of, monkeys on a typewriter. And if we came across their screenplay, would we be able to tell the difference between their Hamlet and Shakespeare's Hamlet? But would it matter? Is there any qualitative...
Here's the question about, think about whether would it matter. Mm-hmm. Let's think about just like a problem that the kind of critical things we have in the text. So suppose we were saying to ourselves, okay, yeah, we think the monkeys did it. Mm-hmm. Let's think the monkeys. So there's first epistemological problem. Can we know whether the monkeys did it or not? So yeah, if we don't know whether the monkeys did it or not, then, that's not something to worry about exactly. We're not likely to think monkeys did. We think something, but suppose we do know the monkeys did. It's kind of like super implausible, but nonetheless, we got video. We saw the monkeys doing it. And then we say to ourselves, so yeah, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, there's a big problem. That is, do we think of the Shakespeare's Hamlet that we're actually meant in the end to admire Hamlet for his hesitations and to think of him as a figure essentially bright for that, or we meant to have a certain kind of contempt for Hamlet and his inability to act? Let's think, how bad is that a problem for the monkeys? So do the monkeys have a conception of who Hamlet is? No, the conditions of the example are they have no fucking clue who Hamlet is. Why? Because they did this by accident, typing forever and ever and ever, and somehow worked out. So if we say, yeah, are we supposed to admire this Hamlet? Or are we supposed to not admire this Hamlet? That question doesn't make sense for the monkeys. Because the monkeys have a version, we're not supposed to, it's not that they don't have views on whether we're supposed to admire them or not. There is no monkey who wrote this could produce the concept of the character of Hamlet, much less the concept of the play. You say, okay, well, then it makes no sense to think about what the monkeys think about it. So what do we think? You say, well, dude, I totally think Hamlet is a pussy, and he should have actually acted. And I say, I, on the other hand, think Hamlet was a good guy. Well, we can completely disagree about that, but then we're disagreeing about that the way we would disagree about a thing in life. You know, if you and I both knew someone, and I said he's a kind of Hamlet character, and you said, yeah, he sort of is. And I said, well, by saying that, I mean I kind of think he's a wuss. And you said, I kind of admire him for his like this and this and this. So fine, we're just disagreeing about it. But we're not thinking there's a kind of correct answer there. We're just thinking, no, we have different views. This guy can never be sort of altered that way. And we're treating, if we go to the text that way, we're making a kind of mistake that Derrida would not have allowed. We're making the mistake of treating the text as if it were not something that meant something, but something that was just a thing in nature, like our friend is a thing in nature. It'd be like a sunset. And you say, I think sunsets make me think of like, you know what? The sun's going to rise tomorrow. It'll be a beautiful day tomorrow. And I say sunsets. I say, I'm old. You're comparatively young. Sunsets make me think, how many more sunsets am I going to get to see? So is there a right answer about what the sunset means? No, there is no right answer about what the sunset means. Why? Because the sunset has no conception of meaning. The sunset has no conception of what a sunset is. Sunset doesn't do any of that stuff. The Hamlet written by the monkeys and the typewriters is just like the sunset. If you think that there's a kind of like 2% thing there where we could still deal with it, the 2%, you might as well be, from the standpoint of against theory, 100% wrong. Because what you're committing to is the idea that basically this thing should be treated the way we treat things in nature, as something that just makes us think of things, and that there is like a standard sort of idea in any sort of philosophy of action or theory of action or theory or language, that there's a certain normativity to it. You use the word used the right way or the wrong way. We understand what something means, or we misunderstand what something means. There is no misunderstanding a sunset. There is no misunderstanding a bunch of marks produced by monkeys. If you can't misunderstand it, you can't understand it. Things can be understood, only they can be misunderstood. You take away that normativity, you're actually, again, I mean, I've been doing this part of this thing for a long time. So the minute you say, well, I agree with almost all of it, what I actually want to say is, no, you don't agree with a single word of it. Because the minute you sort of think that, no, it can't be just like what the guy actually meant, there's something else going on there, then I want to say, yeah, you're treating it as if normativity weren't crucial. And if you're treating it as if normativity weren't crucial, you're treating it as a thing in nature where normativity isn't crucial because, like, we can't be right or wrong about it. And if you're treating it about you can't be right or wrong about it, you're not actually giving an interpretation of it. You're just recording what it makes you think. And yet, there's no right or wrong. I mean, if you say the sunset makes me feel happy and I say it makes me feel sad, there's no one to come along and say, that's not what sunsets are. The point of sunsets is that they do this or they do that. They don't do anything. We can have the same debate about anything in the world. So yeah, the minute you take seriously the idea the monkeys did it, and you therefore take seriously that it's like, in effect, what it's, the effect it's having on you is the meaning, then you're actually no longer in the world of doing meaning at all. So the minute you actually say, no, I think when Hamlet says this, the famous soliloquy, what he's actually going on there is this, and you're not treating it like a sunset, and you're treating it as if the question there is, what did the author of Hamlet mean by this? What did Shakespeare mean?
That actually, I think, clarified the stakes like fairly immediately, and I appreciate that.
So I like Dave's reservations. I like hearing reservations about against theory. It's so fun.
Yeah.
Everybody has some reservations. There are very few people who actually believe this the whole way. Or you believe it.
So yeah, I love it. And for real, there are serious stakes for all of this, at least in my mind. All right.
Think about the Constitution. I mean, but just go back to the math before. Think about the Constitution stuff, where someone said, I was once at a conference early on doing this stuff. I was at a legal conference. And at the end, someone said to me, a guy actually, we were all younger then, became a kind of famous legal theorist, said, I said, Shakespeare, who the fuck cares? I mean, Shakespeare, if Hamlet means what Shakespeare meant by it, that's fine. But if the Constitution means what a bunch of not that all that democratic land-holding, many of them slave-holding white guys in the 18th century meant by it, we are totally fine, right? So, in other words, raise the stakes where it really matters. But that doesn't really change the argument. I mean, it's a good argument about why you might not want constitutional government, right? It's a good argument about why it's not always been the case that people on the left worship the Constitution. Thurgood Marshall wasn't all that far on the left, although in some respects he really was. Thurgood Marshall was famous for saying, hey, look, I mean, he was largely concerned with the racism, but as we all know, the racism was not by any means the only problem in that Constitution. That is, the Constitution is a racist, certainly sexist, but above all, not exactly classist, but class-driven document.
Right.
So if you're on the left, there's the idea of like, no, let's try to invent a world where we can make the Constitution mean what we want it to mean. Or is the idea of like, let's try to invent a world where it's actually not being ruled by Constitution, since there is no one yet who's come up with a theory of constitutional meaning which allows it to go for socialism. So the point's going to be, but that is a place where it really matters. And that is a place where people feel all the time. That's a place where the argument is fought out every day over originalism against originalism. And in fact, the against theory argument is the purest originalist argument there is. It's actually purer than most of the standard originalist arguments, because the standard originalists say, well, no, it doesn't mean what the author means. They hated author intentionality. Scalia completely hated it. What they wanted was it means what the ordinary meaning is to the audience at the time it was spoken. So we've written stuff against that as well.
And that matters because I think that your position is seriously discredited the moment you start saying, no, it's what we want it to mean, because then a person could say, well, then I can make whatever you're saying right now mean whatever I want it to mean. And it just undermines the grounds for any kind of an adult conversation. Right. And if especially if you're using it as a supposed weapon to advance a political cause, it's just going to make people resent you and not take you seriously as an interlocutor.
Well, but to be fair, right, the people of the Constitution were making the arguments that way. That's not the way they start. That's my reductio ad absurdum, what they're saying. I mean, what someone's going to say is, look, the Constitution is a document that meaning changes over time. That's like a standard way of thinking about this. It used to be called the living Constitution. So it doesn't mean the same thing, today that it meant to people in the 1890s. So the question is, and their argument is not that it means today whatever we want it to mean, it's that it means something different from what it meant then. So the question is that true? So the against their argument is that no, that cannot possibly be true. I mean, the reason it can't be true in this is to say, well, what is it that makes the same Constitution if it has different meanings? Like, what is it that's determining that? I mean, it goes back to where we were before, which is that its meaning changes because its readers change. But if its meaning changes because its readers change, and we say, well, its readers read it one way in 1890 and they read it differently in 2024, we can say, yeah, but in 1890, they didn't all read it the same way. Which ones were right and which ones are wrong? This is the normative argument back in the 1890s, because they had disputes over what it meant in their Supreme Courts and all that stuff in the 1890. So you can't say it meant this one thing in the 1890s. If it means things that are different to different readers, then in the 1890s it already meant different things then. And then it already now means different things now. What's the limit on the things it can mean? Well, you could say it doesn't impose any limits on the things it can mean. Maybe the society imposes limits, but that actually is just a way of saying, no, you're allowed to say X, you're allowed to say Y, but you're not allowed to say Z. It used to be you were allowed to say Z, but you're not anymore. So then the problem then becomes, well, we don't really think that it actually has some meaning. What we think is that there are certain kind of conventions about the sorts of meanings you can attribute to it then, and the sorts of meanings you can attribute to it now, but those never solve any problems of dispute, because the problems of dispute are always about two sorts of meanings you could have that people are attributing to it. So the Constitution does prohibit abortion, or does allow abortion, or the Constitution does not allow abortion. So everybody thinks, no, those are two possible interpretations of the Constitution. And then the question becomes, okay, which one's right? But the question of which one's right actually takes you right back to the intentionalist view. Takes you right back to the well, there's no, and again, not because it's desirable. I actually don't think it's desirable for us to live by almost any of the principles that were laid down in the Constitution. Okay. But nonetheless, as you have a constitutional form of government, that's more or less what you're stuck with, unless you get workarounds, which we mainly do, which sometimes we do what we think it tells us to do, and sometimes we don't.
Well, in any
new system would have some kind of, if it's not a constitution, some kind of agreed upon basis, and its intentionality is going to matter, right?
Yeah, well, it's going to be agreed upon, and intentionality is going to matter right away. You're going to see the minute it matters right away, the minute it stops being so agreed upon.
Right.
In other words, the minute someone says, well, there's a famous case, a legal case called Element versus BNS. It's two guys who are making a contract about selling chickens. I'm selling you chickens. And I agree to sell you chickens for I don't remember what it was, let's say $1 a pound. And then the chickens arrive at your place and they're boiling chickens. But you thought they were roasting chickens. And it turns out that actually boiling chickens are cheaper than roasted chickens, lower quality chicken. Chicken that's bred to be roasted is higher quality chicken than a chicken that's bred to be boiled. But you're paying me what seemed to you for roasters. And I'm selling you at a good price. That is, price that's making me a good profit. Boilers, roasters, I wouldn't have been making so much at all. The contract just says chickens. The famous decision of the judge begins like the question in this contract is what is meant by chicken. There's no question, right? The minute we're in agreement, the minute there's a dispute that comes up, the question is what's meant by chicken. So what's the answer going to be? The answer is going to be, in contracts, it's often hard to say because it's what they meant by the chicken. So in courts, people wanted to say, well, you can't go by what they intended because they have two different sets of intentions. That's why you have a problem. You have to go by what chicken actually means. But the word chicken doesn't tell you whether it's a roaster or a boiler. And actually, to them, the word chicken meant to the guy who was selling them, it's roasters. The word chicken meant to the guy who was buying them, it's boilers. They disagreed right away on the meaning of the word chicken, but they didn't know they disagreed on the meaning of the word chicken. So part of the point is going to be is that when you start thinking about the question of what the meaning of the word is, you're already thinking right away about what somebody meant by it. And in a case like that with a contract, you have a disagreement built in right from the start. When you impose a meaning on that, which the judge did, the judge found for basically the defendant, what you're doing is saying the other guy should have known that this is what chickens mean. That doesn't tell you whether it's boilers or roasters. And he should have then acted as if he did. But the point about it is, what he's saying is the other guy should have known what the other guy meant by chicken. And that's always right. It's better to know what the person actually means. But it's not, it's not a solution you can dictate in advance. So part of the problem is that, you want something, a common ground. But the minute the questions of interpretation come up, the reason they come up is because the question is, what is the common ground? You're disagreeing over the common ground.
Right.
So disagreement matters. If we didn't have disagreements, there would never be such a thing as theory of interpretation.
Yep. And we're all about that here. And so I want to see if I could give, we got a sort of, I guess, standard pushback to this line of reasoning, and I'm going to read it. And then I want to take a stab at responding to it from what I take to be your position. And I think I'll also agree with this position, but you might want to say I got it wrong. So let's just see if I got your meaning right. But what he said, this is Mills 8102. He says, what's interesting to me is what's going on in the text that the author is unaware of. I realize that, but I do believe in the inescapability of universal patterns that transcend our awareness in a given activity. And then finally, a little lower, said, I guess I see intent as secondary. And I just wanted to say, okay, seeing intent is secondary, okay, maybe, but the point is that the form of reading a text and looking for what the author missed presupposes that the author had a meaning in the first place. And I would say it goes a step further. You're presupposing you do know what the author actually saw there, right? Like, so if you're looking for what the author misses, you're presupposing that you know what the author meant. So it's one thing to say that you know. So it's one thing that to read something and obviously the author had a meaning in the first place, and then it's another to be like, I know what they mean, but instead of telling you what they mean, I'm going to tell you what they missed. Well, that's very convenient because now you don't have to tell me what they actually meant.
Yeah. So that actually, your little presupposing argument, that's totally in the spirit of against theory. That is, you're already doing it that way. But you don't want to say that the questioner, that Mills, is wrong. I mean, when I was first studying, I was really impressed. When I was trained as a modernist, And so Joyce's Ulysses is always a big text for me. And I remember in studying Ulysses, a professor I was studying with, a very brilliant guy called McKerracher, referred to something he called Zipf's law. I'm remembering this correctly. So Zipf's law was this. It's a guy who was doing work on kind of work you can do much easier now with the computers, but then large amounts of text. And what he was trying to show, and what he did sort of show, was that in any sufficiently large text, Ulysses was plenty large enough, the number of words that were only used once was about equivalent to the times that the one word that was used most often was used. So if you had maybe 1,000 words that are only used once, word that's used most often would be used about 1,000 times. And this was true in any large language text. And it was true of Ulysses, and it was also true of a writer who was totally different, and would also be true of a cookbook or whatever. So it's a pure example. So when someone says, Joyce going for that? The answer's got to be no. I mean, it's possible that Joyce was, but no one believes Joyce is saying. An important thing about this is that I want to make sure that the number of words I use only once more or less equals the number of times I use this one word that we use most often. It's like a law of the language. So is there any problem with being interested in that? Not only no problem with it, everybody's interested in that. It's a kind of interesting fact about English and about large quality things of prose. Would that be useful in interpreting Ulysses? It's totally not useful in interpreting Ulysses. Why? Precisely because it's true of every text, including Ulysses and including every other text. So then we might say, well, but what would make it interesting in interpreting Ulysses? Well, what would make it interesting would be if you thought, actually, no, what we see here is that we just discovered the thing about Joyce is that actually he was the first person to read Zipf's article, and he knew this law. And Joyce, being the kind of gamester that he was, Joyce actually worked in something where actually in Ulysses it's not true. In Ulysses, he violates Zipf's law. Now, he violates Zipf's law, that's an intentional act. That's something he'd be doing on purpose. And then in his next text, The Niggan's Wake, he observes Zipf's law. So yeah, you can make Zipf's law relevant to the meaning of the text, but you make it relevant to the reading of the text right away by making it a function of what Joyce is doing. So there's a way in which it's true. I mean, there are a lot of things that are true about everything we do, that we're not conscious of doing them, and that they're not even intended by us. And in writing, for sure, that's true. The question is when those. I mean, a standard example would be this: I write a poem, and I write a poem. It's back in the days of typewriters on a piece of cheap typewriter paper. So does the fact that it's written on cheap typewriter paper matter? So does the paper it's written on matter? Well, 99 times out of 100 it does. But suppose the poem is, it's about commerce is driving everything to the bottom. It's a race to the bottom in quality. Poetry gets worse. Even the paper the poems are written on gets worse. And you think, okay, is that part of the meaning of the poem? In other words, should we actually take the paper as part of the meaning, as a way in which it's not just, no, it would be exactly the same poem if it were written on high quality paper as it is on low quality paper? Well, that's a question. There's no obvious answer in the sense that there's no automatic answer. Most of the time we think, no, if you read Ulysses in a cheap edition, if you read Ulysses online, if you read Ulysses in a kind of super expensive edition, it's all the same text. But in fact, if the point of the text was to be read on a certain kind of paper rather than a certain other kind of paper, then you would think, no, it's not all the same text. You're not getting the same thing. You're not getting what Joyce was going for. So the question of the stuff that is automatic, the stuff that the author is not thinking of, it begins to matter if the author is thinking of it, but with respect to the meaning of the text, it doesn't matter if the author didn't mean anything by it. Now, there's a final version of that, which is, well, what about unconscious meanings? Yeah, fine, absolutely unconscious meanings, but those are intended. They're just unconsciously intended. In other words, if you're thinking about a kind of Freudian thing, the guy was only conscious of referring to, the cigar. But actually, what he meant by the cigar, in this case, Freud to the contrary, notwithstanding, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. What he meant by cigar was a kind of phallic thing, although he was not aware of it. Yeah, but that's an intentionalist argument. That's a way of saying, no, we need to have a broader concept of intention. We don't just mean, things that you are like self-consciously aware of at the time. And we're perfectly happy to accept that. There's no argument about that. The argument is not whether questions intention should be conscious or unconscious. It's about whether it's intentional or not. So I think that, when you're doing like the kind of automatic things, it's one thing to say you're interested in them. There's no reason not to be interested in them. They reveal things about the language. They may reveal things about the person, right? But they're not the same as revealing things about the meaning of the text. And if someone wants to say we can be interested in things that are not the meaning of the text, totally.
Okay.
No objection.
Okay. That's a really, really useful clarification that probably means I don't even need to get into a couple of the things that I was going to bring up. But I want to say the reason that the stakes matter for me, the first one that I alluded to is that we want to understand the situation so that we can intervene or change it. You said, for instance, we don't need political theory. We just need to build a working class movement. And then you assume that that's going to be through unions. I would say that is political theory, right? That you have a political presupposition about the subject of change, or the emphasis where politics needs to be focused on, that's based in your time in this world, right? Like, so I don't share the idea that it would be through unions. That's in my own experience in theory. And so like my experience in theory should be corrected if it's wrong. And it might be wrong.
No, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't disagree with that.
Okay.
I mean,
so
I disagree with you about the union part, but I don't disagree with you about the idea that, yeah, you have a political theory, a theory of what change is.
right.
I guess what I would say is that, our basic, if we all agree, and I won't agree with this, but if we all agree that no kind of socialism will be successful unless the working class is at the heart of producing it,
Right.
then the agreement on that already suggests. So then we might say, well, will unions do it or will something else do it? Yeah, I think that is a real disagreement we could have.
Right.
But the point would then be is that we're already committed, let's say, to a kind of at least set of reservations about kind of academic vanguardism. I'm pretty sensitive about that. So McManus was saying, well, he's not going to shit on himself enough to say that guys don't matter. He was being kind of modest about this. But the thing about it is, you do want to say it is actually a really bad sign for, working class movements today, that by far the vast majority of people who are into them are professors.
Yes.
And who have not only not succeeded, and I totally include this myself among this, not succeeded in actually making a working class movement more alive, but actually have, no doubt against our will, been part of the process which has made the working class movement seem more likely at this point to be a right-wing movement than to be a left-wing movement.
Right.
With the fact that people hate, the fact that people hate elite colleges, there's a lot of good reasons. There are many, many good reasons to hate elite colleges. But if you are a professor of political science at an elite college, you're part of what they hate. And it's not because you're trying to do it, but nonetheless, you are part of an apparatus that is producing a politics which is not only not attractive to you, but is like actually a really, really bad politics. So, that's setting aside the question of whether it's unions or something else.
Right.
That's a problem.
Well,
that's why I love Theory Underground. That's why I agree to do this. Because like I actually am, podcasts, in my view, suck. I hate podcasts. I hate the plurality of them. I never listen to them. I never do any of this. And you'll know, when you wrote me back this time, I said, I'm not that interested in doing it. And you played what I call the worker card. And then you wrote me a very eloquent email, which I have saved, about making a difference. So I totally get that. In other words, talking to a bunch of like academics, talking about literary theory, it's fine. Literary theory, academics want to hear about that. That's the thing we do, and it's a good environment. Talking to a bunch of academics about how race class stuff. At this point, I just don't see the possible point in it for me. I'm not saying anything that they don't already know in a certain way. You try to convince them. You can maybe shut them up in the argument, but if you shut them up, they just go home and say what an asshole Michaels is. So I couldn't think of anything to say at that moment, but I totally don't believe that. But no, I do think that it's important. First of all, it's intrinsically pleasurable people who have jobs that don't involve thinking about questions like, well, what does determine the meaning of a text, nonetheless can be interested in the question of what determines the meaning of text, just find it pleasurable to think about. So we should all be able to have that kind of pleasure. So if you can help someone have that kind of pleasure, that's worth doing it. Second of all, it does have a kind of political purchase because, you want to be able to have, in effect, the idea that we can develop the tools to think about these problems. I mean, for me, it would be like, go back to the Constitution one. When someone starts telling you that, like, basically liberal judges will help us out of this, and if we could just get liberal judges, you want to be able to say, well, what kind of solution is that? That's going to be, it's going to be a temporary solution because it means that we get judges to sort of more think what we think, and therefore they'll interpret the Constitution as meaning more what we mean. But in fact, we should not make this battle about like originalism versus anti-originalism. We should not, as people who are political animals, invest ourselves in that question. What we should be invested in is the way of making the outcomes we want come about. And really, truly, if we're going to push that one, we should invest in the way of saying the Supreme Court should have a lot less power than it does, because interpreting this document and coming up with theories that justify our interpretation of this document, when actually what we're really doing is expressing our priors and doing this, is actually politically, it looked good for us, people thought, during the Warren Court back in the 50s and the 60s. Now it looks totally bad for us, but it was never that good for us. And it really is bad for us, because there's nothing democratic about it at all. It's not democratic. It's not something that we have, as working people, have control over.
I think that's basically a perfect place to wrap this segment up. I just want to say in close, and I'll also let Nan say his closing thought, and then you can say your goodbyes, but that the other stake is a rigor stake. And that for me, I'm always looking to not take the easy way out, even though I constantly do. I'm constantly finding myself taking the easy way out. And so I do look for these sort of checks and balances to kind of hold me to some kind of a higher standard than what my bad habits kind of take me into. And like self-congratulatory cherry picking of text would be one example of a way that I can fall into something that's not really rigorous, right? And I think that we all can be guilty of this, right? Well, for me, the big concern here, whether it's with my students at the university or my students at Theory Underground, we need to be checking these various things. And when a person says, well, I'm not really interested in what the author's saying, I'm interested in what they're missing, there was what was being presupposed, sure. But also, I want to just say, I really like how you sort of steel-manned Mills's position, and I actually agree 100%, and I think that that's a very worthwhile position to have. We just have to remember, is it both and, or is it either or? Because if you're just going for the kind of, I think that this is what they're saying, and so I'm going to go look for what they're not saying, well, have you actually done the work of really wresting from the text what you think they're saying, or are you kind of just rushing forward with whatever's kind of fun in the moment or whatever serves your immediate, impulses?
I think it is worthwhile just to think about that part, because it's true. I mean, some texts are pretty easy to understand. Lots of them are. Some texts are hard to understand. So people have often said, well, you do against theory, you'd say it's the author's intention just making the thing too easy. But I'm sorry, no one has ever read any Hegel. Things that, you just trying to figure out what Hegel meant, it makes it so easy. It's hard to figure out what Hegel meant.
Yes.
It's actually totally hard to figure out, certain questions about what Shakespeare meant. And he was going for making it entertaining, which Hegel, despite the kind of funny parts, was not going for making it entertaining at all times. So it is really worthwhile to think, we should all be for the kind of rigorous study of difficult texts. And the attempt is not to avoid the difficulty, and the attempt should not really be to try to foreground the difficulty. So that seems to me, it's not exactly against theory lesson, but it is a really important thing to remind people of, which is that a lot of things we care about just are hard. If it's saying, if you think that, the parts that you're interested in are just parts that you're going to single out as the immediate thing on you as the part you like about it. Yeah, but the question is whether the part you like about it really is there. The question is whether actually it means something different from actually the parts you like about it. And maybe the parts you like about it is just like your fucking imagination. You should like let that part go and figure out what actually is going on. So yeah, I do think in general. I mean, one thing I think is good. One thing I think we don't use internet stuff for enough. I don't know how you guys do your classes, but as we were doing this, I thought it's fun. I like talking about against theory, but it's even more fun to talk about against theory if you're in a situation where a bunch of people have just read one or two texts about this. Because people do have, everybody has kind of strong, immediate responses. Everybody's response with me just for the author intended is going to be to say, some people are going to say, yes, it does, but with a 2% reservation. And some people are going to say, no, it doesn't. What about this? What about that? I've heard people discuss me and say, it's crazy to think that, and then go on from there. Someone just sent me a copy of a podcast where neither Stephen or I was on, which was unfortunate because they kept on raising examples that we had lots of responses to, but they didn't think of it. And I think it would be kind of fun to sit down online with like 50 people who had read the text and then say, okay, I'm going to give you 15 minutes of this is what the argument is. And now you all have read it and you've read some of the critiques of it. There are a million critiques of it in the world. What are your views? And then argue it out. Because the thing is that there are a lot of things to argue about, and it's worth having those arguments. Maybe not because it pays off in your everyday life in the sense of, okay, now I know how to interpret better, because you don't, basically. That's part of the argument. But because thinking anything through can, go back to what I said before, be first pleasurable. And more people should have that pleasure, not that they have to go to a university to get it. And second, sometimes thinking something through can not only be pleasurable, but can just like help you to think about other things, which may matter a whole lot more. Like in this case, the question of constitution and democracy. That will be worthwhile, that you're not going to get out of thinking about Shakespeare. But anyway, I'm totally up to my time. I'm glad you convinced me to do this because I actually totally enjoyed it. And I'm happy to come back sometime.
Thank you.
I'll let you guys go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
All right, before I cut to the PSA, I just want to let you know the PSA is outdated. It's been around for a few months. Yes, you can still subscribe at the Theory Underground website. You can either subscribe to the McKerracher seminar or the Michael Downs seminar. But I just want you to know, if you sign up at $50, when we transfer to the new framework, you'll be at $30. You'll be grandfathered in, meaning you are getting a lot more bang for your buck, right? If you are at $30 and you get transferred over, you will be now getting the value of the $50 tier. If you are at $75 and you get transferred over, you will be getting the value of a $100 tier. And if you are at $99 when you get transferred over, you will be grandfathered in so that you get access at $150. That's amazing. We've made it so that in the transfer to the new framework, people who get involved now are going to have epic access. So now's the time. Now is definitely the time. So enjoy.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of the situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory.
You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Timenergy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Žižek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button, subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McKerrachers are doing, then the best way is to become a tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a tier 2 subscriber to each of us. The reason this matters is because tier 2 is like pretty much the best bang for your buck. It gives you huge discounts on all of the courses that we do. But if you can't afford it, tier 4 is amazing because it gives you tier 3 access at both Mikey's seminar and ours.
And finally, not everybody has time to be part of these ongoing research seminars, and they just want to fund the paid content for the YouTube and podcast. And so thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon. They're the ones funding all the free stuff. So big thank you to Bert, Marilyn, Carl, Sahil, Zozandra, Nikolai, Darian, Tyler, and Mandeep, and all the other wonderful patron people, Patreon people. And thank you to all the other wonderful Patreon people. Thank you so much to all of you patrons, and also to the special subscribers and the paying subscribers. Oh my God. It's just so awkward. Thank you, patrons. Okay. And to all the other wonderful patrons. Thank you so much, all you patrons. And also a special thanks to the subscribers on the YouTube side, as well as the paying subscribers over at Substack. Why do we do this?
Fuck. You guys, just thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making this bullshit possible. Thank you to the subscribers. You do it. You did so good. Thanks, guys.